And the original one was in 1994 and was written by Tim Sledger. And when we heard Tim Sledger talking about MGraph, he always said, in fact, that the beginning of MGraph was not really MGraph, but LAT made by Professor Pierrot, in fact. So with this LAT, in fact, I will speak about that a bit much later, in fact, what is LAT exactly. Then that MGraph at that time was mainly building square matrix elements and evaluate square matrix elements. As Johan said, the second biggest step, and even more difficult problem in some sense, is making the integrations. And that is much more later, in 2002, when Tim Sledger and Fabio Maltoni, my PhD supervisor at the time, make, in fact, an event, which is simply taking the square matrix element from MGraph and make the integrations by the techniques that we learned, in fact, by Johan this morning. So then the next big steps forward in some sense is in beyond the standard model to include also in MGraph. So because at that stage it was only standard model. So at that stage, one of the biggest for MGraph 4 was to be able to make an SSM executive field theory to HDM, for example, or a lot of other models was included at that stage. And now we are going even further in some sense. So MGraph 5 started in 2009, already 2 years ago. And one of the biggest changes of MGraph that changed the programming language. So before it was in Fortran, this is, I don't know, where already wrote something in Fortran here? Nobody? Ah, yes, everybody, yeah. No, Cabo. You didn't write any line in Fortran? In Fortran code, probably write a lot of lines in Fortran, right? No? Okay, so maybe your PhD student then. So Fortran was quite a nightmare to develop, and it's very fast for computational things, so making computations like a number, additional number, multiplying it, and things like that. But if you want to create some diagrams and to write file, things like that, it's just a nightmare. So it changed completely our mind in some sense, and fast for program is in principle is very slow, because it's we not compile it, which is Python, so in principle this language is very slow. But the real speed of a program is not the intersect speed, but how you write the program. And how fast is your implementation on how you're making things. And that's why MGraph 5 is very powerful, very fast at the end. So one of the advantages of Python is very flexible, it's very, and the speed is there when you need. So we can optimize things for it very fast at the end. But in principle, with some of the number, okay, that's not that fast. It's very modular, that's object-oriented, so that's very cool. We have automatic documentations, so we don't have to write long manual to push on a button and the manual is written for us. And one thing that is quite important, in fact, is the test suite. So in Python, it's very easy to test everything. So test each function, each functionality, and that's helped us with a code that is quite robust and we can trust, which of course is important. And of course, in MGraph 5, we made a lot of new algorithms which speed up the code by huge factors. So let me first show you the time impact for all those processes. So this is a list of not that easy processes in practice. And you have the time for MGraph 4, MGraph 5, and here different information, the number of sub-processes, the number of diagrams to see how difficult they are. Let me just first point one standard model is equals to minus 3 jets, and you can see here that you have a factor 10 between the two. So I read there a huge difference in fact. So in fact, for time, I always like to say a comment about Tim Sledger, in fact, with the original author of MGraph. He said, I don't care about time speed, because what I need to do at the end is push on the button, then take a coffee, and when I'm back, okay, the program is there. So if the program is 2 times long, or this takes 2 coffee. That's okay. Okay, that's true. But anyway, speed is a bit important, especially when it's that huge number in some sense. Because then you can do things that you cannot do before. And let me point the second part where there are also big improvement, in fact. It's here to factor 6 where it's decaying. So that's the one that you did this morning, in fact, with Johan. And you see that it was very fast to create, 25 seconds. But, and here it's all the output Johan, I think. Yeah. And in MGraph 5 that's a bit longer. So probably, in fact, in the tutorial 2 years ago, you will not show that example because it's a bit too long for a talk. So this will show you a bit the improvement. But even more for example, if we did CT bar with full decay, that we'll do in a few hours, in fact, which is in all the full decay, it was 5,600 seconds. So if you can translate in minutes, that's quite a long time to wait, at least. And now it's 15 seconds. So I push on the button, I look at what that diagram, and oh, it's already finished in some sense. So that's very big improvement in some sense. And of course, the worst one, that's really the same diagram as CT bar, but now in MSSN. So the first time you can take the copy, your child also, and the child goes also. But now in, I think, 4 minutes, if I'm correct, in 4 minutes you can have your square matrix element. So a very huge and impressive work, in fact, on this. And with that, in fact, you can really do new things. That's very important for that. It's not only time, not only number of copy, but now we can do things that you cannot do before. So why is the deviation, in fact, much more powerful? So let's look a bit at the deviation's first syntax, and you will understand a bit the spirit also why it's most powerful. So the syntax I will show a bit this morning. You first create the first level. So I say I create bottom with CT bar and the W here. Then after you specify the decay, first decay of the top and the sub decay in the W, then the same for the anti-top and finally for the W. So the parenthesis has to define what a sub decay of something. That's when you put parenthesis. And when we make the generation, we generate those things completely separately. So in some sense, we generate four independent processes first. Which is quite fast because it's 2 to 3, 1 to 2, 1 to 2, yeah. So most of those are very fast to generate first. Then after we need to combine those, and that's where the difficulties come from. So let's take another example, which is UU bar with 2 Burino. So, and then making the Burino decay in UU bar and then Spalino. So quite easy, in fact. We generate those separately. Then we have 3 diagrams for this process and 2 diagrams for this process. So that means that the number of diagrams will be what? It's 3 times 2 times 2. Why times 2 square here? Because there are, of course, 2 Burino. We need to connect this at each Burino. So this means all those diagrams. And this way of combining is extremely fast compared to the old way, which was we create all the possible diagrams with those UU bar and all those final state particles, then only pick the 12 we were corresponding to the intermediate particles. So that's why also it was so slow in the previous one and so fast in this one. So that's a very huge improvement. So one thing, I think Johan talked a bit already about that. Okay, it doesn't matter if you have too many overlap. But I'll tell you a bit about this. Okay. So decay chain contains the full square matrix element. So quite often, another way to simulate decay chains is that first you generate your events, then you pass to a external program, in fact, to take your initial events and then make it decay. But if you are doing that, you lose completely all interference between the decay, between the difference, and also within the curve matrix element. Or you have some of them, but not the full spin correlation at least. And also you have here the full width effect, because you don't have to generate first your sample on shell, you can have the full width effect. So that's completely the full square matrix element, so it's very completely powerful. However, there is one problem with this, or not a real problem, that we generate only few of the diagrams for the final states. So that means that we don't have interference with all the other diagrams. So that means that what we generate, in fact, doesn't make sense far away of the pole mass. Because otherwise, far away of the pole mass, of course, the interference are quite important. And the other diagrams are quite important too. So, in order, in some sense, to solve the problem, or let's make this valid, we have, in fact, a parameter, which is the PW cutoff, which allow, in fact, to generate those only close to the pole mass. To not have the wrongly defined contributions. So another example of decay chains. So I present this in Madison at a Fino conference a few months ago. And when I showed this slide, it was a silence completely. For you, it's probably the first time you say, okay, That's 2 to 14 particles. That doesn't mean that much. But I think a few years ago, we didn't even think about being able to generate this type of things. And a few years ago, we even need to change the maximum number of events, final states, in order to be able to generate it. Because and change also with the integrations. So it was really a big achievement that we can do now is that many particles in the final states. That's quite very amazing. And that's work directly in out of the scratch. And even integration is very fast. So speaking about integration, so also the integration time was quite improved in Mon4 and Mon5. So let me focus on this one in fact. So lepton plus lepton minus in jets. So that's on the personal computer of Johan. And
not this one.
Not this one, the previous one. It was better or?
The previous one was much slower.
Much slower, okay. Yeah, I think so, because one time I put my number, it was much better for both in fact. So you pass from 20 minutes to 3 minutes on generation time. So also there it's this time I would say you cannot do you take 7 more coffees, quite interesting. The second one is if you add 1 jet, it's even more impressive. So you pass from 3 hours to 12 minutes. So that's quite impressive too. So that's very interesting. And for example now, it's even possible to run on your laptop 50 bar plus 1, 2, 0, 1 and 2 jets on your laptop. It's also quite amazing for speed point of view. So why in fact this is much faster than before? That in fact in my event we have a new way to write the output. And that means that we reduce in fact the number of integration that we need to do. So we combine all the processes in the same type of initial and final state. So that means color, same spin, same mass, and same weight. And we combine all the integration channel with exactly the same full structures. So if you remember the previous talk, in fact, we show you that we integrate about the single enhanced diagram. And we integrate about the weighting there. And of course, it's exactly the same diagrams with the same mass in it. So you have exactly the same poles. You can integrate those two at the same time, so not split in integrals. And this is an example, proton-proton L plus and minus 2 jets. And it creates, as you will see in fact this morning, 4 directory, which is one for gluon-gluon, lepton-lepton, 2 quarks, one gluon, 1 quark, 2 quarks, and 2 quark impulse in the final state 2 quarks. And that's the number of integrations, so quite reasonable. And that's the number of matrix elements associated to each of them. So that's the difference because the couplings are different. One is further, which is up or down. And one thing to compare is the number of integration channels in Mon4. It's 486. So this looks like, okay, that's very quite easy to do. In fact, that's not that easy to do. And this is a really huge factor between the two. So to reset, in fact, the integration channel, you have all these diagrams. They are quite identical, in fact. Simply different particles in the final state sometimes, or permutation of particles. And all those diagrams will be combined in one for the integration point of view. So there is few of the new things of Mon4. So I will speak, in fact, about superfast decay chains. I will speak about. I will speak also a bit that we can have in Mon4 any type of Lorentz structures, a lot of type of color, and any number of particles by vertex. So that means that for the Anderson model, we can really do what we want. Especially for color, we have new color structures that are allowed, so not only the standard one, but all the color sextets and epsilon ijk. I will speak a bit, I will not speak about it anymore in fact, about the compact organization of the subprocess, so, and the integration channel in elements, so I will speak about that. One other thing is related to what we discussed this morning, it's we have in fact different outputs for malware, and I will speak more about that. And one of the quite important one is in an interface for PKAs. And linked to a bit all the things we above, in fact, we have a completely automatic way to write a model and elicit the amplitude, in fact, both in Fortran and C++. So all the code, in fact, in Python, so we can translate things in Fortran and C++, because those, when you need to make numerical computations, it's important that very simple are very fast, so not be stick with Python. And as you will see in a few hours, in 1 hour or so, we have a really nice user interface, so a really nice way, and I would say funny way, in fact, to interact with the program and to make physics, in fact. Personally, I really like it. So, let me first speak about a bit the code organizations that will give you a bit the spirit of Mon4. So, if you just type ls in the Mon4 directory, with quite a bunch, in fact, not that much directory. So, what are they? So the first one is MGraph. This contains all the Python code, in fact, for in MGraph. So more in details, in that we have 4 parts. You have the core, which contains all the basics objects, all the color definitions, so all the basics, in fact, how to make a diagram, how to compute a diagram. The second one, IO is for all input-output, so how to write a file in Fortran, in C++, how to write this in how to write a diagram also with the nice pictures, how to read a model with different input formats for models, so how to read those and all these type of things. We are one looking for the interface, so that's when you type something to be interpreted by the code and translated into a real command. And finally, some various things like a lot of times that's for help people and to help us with things. So not really important things here, but quite important for the code and all this work at the end. So the idea is that it's quite really modular, in fact. If you have a new ID, it's quite very simple, in fact, to say, okay, that's a nice file, I need to extend this a bit, and it's very easy, at least for us, so we say, to extend it. That's really one important point, because another file is for us only a beginning, in fact, of something. We would like to have an LO in it, that will be probably in 1 year from now, maybe a bit more or less, but that's the time scale. So one of the ideas of Mon4 is that's a starting point, so that's a way where we can start to make physics with it, and to improve vastly also the code. So that's quite important to have a flexible code from that point of view. So the other directory, of course, the model, which is quite important for you, because that's there that you put the information about the model, what is the server model, what is the MSSM, the executive theory, or a bunch of them. That's where you have all this information. With MGraph, which is an external program to create automatically a last routine, I will speak more about that later. Template, which is simply a directory where you have all the information how to, for template files for Fortran, C++, things like that, or in this case, Fortran. Then the other directory, bin, that's where you have all the binaries, that means 1. Input directory, that's quite important too, in fact. That's where you can reconfigure, in fact, Mon4. So, for example, if you don't like vi to edit a file, then you go there with a file, then you can say, I would like to use evac, for example. So, you can change. You can also say, I don't like to use Firefox, or I have to use Safari to open the web page, things like that. So, very simple things, but might be useful. And also, we can define what's the default name for particles, what is the defined multi-particles at the beginning, and things like that. Finally, there are 3 others that I will not say too much about it. This is simply documentation. This is external program that I will just click from somewhere else and then put there. And that's, this will I will explain a bit more in fact. That's a test suite. So I will put a few words about it. So test suite is a way for us to test if our program is working or not. And in fact, what's quite important because those files here, I think this one takes around, I think, 40,000 lines of code. And this directory is also 40,000 lines of code. So to give you a bit of the importance we put on the test, it's roughly half and half. And we have 3 different types of tests. The unit test is really testing function by function. So each function that we implement in MGraph, we test it and say if it should produce that, we test it. The second is we simulate a user. If I type this and then this and then this, I expect to have that. And finally, one of the one that takes the most of the time is a parallel case. So we compare everything compared to MGraph 4, or for when it's possible to have overlap between the two. And there's more than 6,000 processes inside a model, MSSM, random subas, and also spin2. Then you check it with MGraph 4 to ensure that everything is working. So, of course, that's quite something important to, okay, that's working. Very fundamental. So, let's be back a bit to physics, and in fact to what is LS amplitude. That's really the way we write the square matrix element. And this was invited by Professor Kerwo, I think in 1991, so I have the dates in 2 slides later. So the idea is how to evaluate numerically these square matrix elements. So here I take an example, E plus and minus, going to the photon, became E plus and minus. So of course you can square the amplitude, that's quite easy. But now numerically, how you are doing it? I think my first idea would say, okay, I will square this, then take the sum of the helicity, and then it's, well, what I do in the paper in some sense. That will be probably one or two bad ideas, probably, or some computer or some competitor using that idea, in fact. So, but in fact, there is a smarter way. So it's using the fact that these are simply numbers for given helicity. So we don't have to sum the helicity analytically. We can simply say, I will take one helicity, compute the number with it, associated to the amplitude, and then take the second one and so on. So that's simply the idea. So how do we know what are those numbers? On what they are depends? The momentum, the mass of the particles, and the helicity, of course. So not the mass, no, the mass. So that's simply, in fact, that's 4 codes. I have 4 routines. They are created, in fact, by hand for a long time ago. And you simply set A, the momentum, A, the other information, it's create for you what are those 4 numbers. And when you have those numbers, you can look at the interactions. So let's look at the first interactions. I have an electron and a positron creating a photon. Then we create what is the number set to the photon. So that means this loop bubble. And then that's another routine that should in principle be written by hand. And when I have that, I can pass to the following vertex and take the combine again and so on. So that's a very easy way, and very fast way in fact. It's a very efficient way to evaluate square matrix elements. And also very easy to automate, because you just have to follow what is the diagrams. So it's easy to automate, and that's very fast, so that's very powerful. So these lines are, of course, can be written by MGraph quite efficiently. That's why the team, in fact, said that MGraph starts with LS, with those routines, because what MGraph does at the end is just write those lines. The hard work is creating those lines, that's really true.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
This is a very general question. If the tensor structure P mu mu, it contains derivatives, then what happens?
So in principle, for each different Lorentz structure that you have here, you should have, of course, a new interaction. So that's different functions that you need to call. That's a very interesting thing, because that's, I was supposed to do that a bit later, but let me take now, or we can skip. Yeah. So the point that for each new Lorentz structures, you need an addition routine. And if those routines are written by hand, that means that if the routine doesn't exist, that's finished. That means that you cannot generate a square matrix element, right? So that was, in fact, the problem 1 year ago, still in some sense, because at that time, we need to write those routines by hand. That's not that difficult in some sense when you know what you are to do. But then, of course, you need also to validate them. So, for example, for people, it takes around 1 month to create those routines for a given process. So, if you need to start from scratch, start to learn what it is exactly, and what are all the conventions, because that's not always that easy, then it takes quite a lot of time. So, yeah, that's not probably the next one. Yeah, so that what I said here, that's a zero restriction on bad graph before, but now in fact we have U4 alert. So but this allow is exactly a program we wrote automatically this for you. So in some sense now, for each neural structure, you give that to Alloa, and Alloa creates the routine. So that's not a problem anymore. Okay, let me go back. Okay, so one of the advantages, in fact, that we introduced in matter 5 with those velocity amplitude is that we can simply reuse them. So let's take those diagrams. So that's 3 diagrams for a gluon going 2 gluons and U bar. And you see that some parts, those red box here and those red box here, in fact exactly the same. And as the helicity mainly depend only on the momentum, that means that the wave function associated with this gluon and this gluon are exactly the same in those 3 cases. So in fact, we need only to compute it once, and then we already have the answer of the 2 others. And after, it's slightly different, so we need to call other LS functions. But that means that we can reuse quite often the same LS code. And that speeds up matter 5 by a huge factor. Because that's what it's not doing in matter 4, because it was quite complex to do that in matter 4. It's quite trivial to do in matter 5. And that is a huge factor of time. So this is the time for one phase response compared to matter 4 and matter 5.
Olivier?
Yes?
Actually, it was done also in MGraph 4, but the way that the diagram generation was done in MGraph 4 made it much less efficient. So if you would not do this at all, you would have another factor 10 more diagrams.
Okay? Okay.
And more waveforms.
Okay. I don't know. So, for example, you are going in 6 leptons, EPC minus, EPC minus, EPC minus. The number of wave functions, so the number of calls to LS, is a factor 10 between the two, which is of course only factor 2 for the one time. Okay. And also, for this one here, we pass from 700 to 100, and here also a huge factor of time. So that's also why, in fact, number 5 is faster than number 4. So simply those basic ideas of basic routine. So I already speak about a lot, in fact, about LS, and now I have the year, so now I'm sure it's 1991. So that's LS was invented by Professor Karuo and Moyama. That's the correct pronunciation. And Watanabe. So few years later, probably around 2002, 2005, I don't know, we also included in those routines the MSSM, which are quite similar to the differences, but also we also include spin 2, things like that. The last library was rising. But as I said, it's fully dependent on the Lorentz structures. So I already said that was a big problem for Malware for the time, and that the solution is UFO and ALA. So UFO, it's simply a type of model, and that Benjamin will talk quite a lot about what is the model and how you define in details the model. And ALA is simply the solution to a problem, because it takes that model, information of that model, and write the helicity routine from there. So if you have the model information, so if you know what is the Lorentz structure in it, it's in fact easy to pass, or very easy in fact, and to write the routine systematically. So what we need exactly, we need the Lorentz structures, and we need something that is fast and flexible. And also one thing is quite important, and it's a code which is can write the output not in Fortran, but also in C++, for example. And we also plan to make it for GPU and all this type of thing. So having a way to automate all those routines, because also, as Johan said, if we ask a PhD student to do something, or even a professor, we are sure that at the point order there will be a minus sign somewhere, I missing. Well, that's normal. That's, you cannot make a perfect code. And even in matter 5, for sure, there are some bugs, but for sure also. But the advantage is that at the point we will find it, and then it will be much better time after time. And this then allows calculations of matrix elements for any Lorentz structures and for any particle multiplicity 2. So you can have 5-point interactions, 6-point interactions, there are no limitation in more at all. So let me take an example about it. So that's about medieval vertices first, and that's Higgs effective theory. So who know what is Higgs effective field theory? Not that much. Okay, that's good. So you can learn. So the idea is to add to MSSM a new vertex which is beyond going to an X. Now, if this vertex exists, yeah? No, of course this vertex doesn't exist. So why are you doing something which doesn't exist? We have an idea? Yeah, there's a link with the top. So the idea is the top loop. If we have a gluon, the gluon is coupled to a loop of top, and then the X coupled also to the top.
Actually, you can draw it on the blackboard.
Yeah, I know. I can also do that. You don't see here? Oh, you don't have the loop, but that's all. So this is simplification. So that's the idea of that model, in fact. And if, so let's keep that for the tutorial, because we'll speak about this a bit more about the tutorial, so let's keep at that. About the validity of this model. So, in fact, on the fact that QCD is not billion, we need to introduce billion X vertex, but also 3 billion vertex, 4 billion 3 billion in the X, 4 billion in the X. And this, in number 4, since 5-point interaction was not possible at all in number 4, so the way to do is to introduce heavy particles, like here. So we introduce very heavy particles. So when I mean very heavy, like 10 TeV, or 100 TeV, it doesn't really matter. And I need to say that particle is so heavy that we are free in the tail. And that means that we don't see the Bragg-Wigner, that's simply flat, some sense at the end. So then we can play with the couplings in order to have the correct couplings for the four things at the end. So that in fact we don't have the kinematics of these particles. So it's simply fake particles to create a 5-point interaction. So that means that's a bit, of course, painful, not very optimal. So that's the LS core, and we're going to see here, if you know what LS is, that we have tensor core for those fake particles. But now with matter 5, what we can do is use 5-point interactions directly. So you don't have that quite of mess that you say, okay, I need to split my 5-point interactions in 3-point interactions, add fake particles into the spectrum simply for that. You can simply have a 5-point interactions like this. And then if you look at the LS routine, you can say here, well, you need to do the syntax, but it's much longer in some sense simply because it asks more arguments with the 5-point interactions. So you don't have that limitation anymore. A second mutation, in fact, in matter 5, which is also in some sense the same space, is multivariant. The point with multivariance, that's the flow. That's quite important. So on that stage, what we decide is, in fact, this is the particle incoming, and that's the linkage outgoing. So on that stage, on this and this, the flow are not the same. So that's, for the MGraph point of view, that's not the same vertex. Of course, you can pass from one with to the other by fields identity. I will not speak about that. So for the first one, we have the flow coming from the quark up to the other quark. So that means that the flow are going like this. That's completely equivalent to saying that we have a heavy non-propagating particles, which is here with the flow, and it's not really like that. Why? The other one, the other interactions, is simply the opposite way. So the up, the flow is going to the top, so like this, and then simply equivalent to have heavy particles in the T channel. So these kind of things were in fact created in MGraph 4. generate those type of things. So let me show the radiation plots, in fact, between matter 4 and matter 5. So in gray, that's the 4 fermion vertex as in matter 5. And in blue, that's what we have in matter 4. So let me insist that this scale is 10,000 GeV, so 10 TeV, so very high scale. So the physics, of course, doesn't occur in this part. And as we put, clearly, you can see here, the mass of the phase particles to 10 TeV, clearly you can say that in this area, we see the dynamics, in fact, of the particles. So you see that we have a disagreement, that's expected. While in the place where the physics is, so the HG, we are in perfect agreement between the two ways to describe the process. So also that's simplified, in fact, our line. You don't have to use this type of particles. So the next thing I would like to discuss is the output format of matter 5. So thanks to U4 and Aloha, we have now an automatic way to have elicity routine in any languages. So currently, in fact, that's been Fortran, C++, and Python. So if you have the last routines in any languages, of course, you can have also matrix element outputs in all those languages. So in Fortran, that's what you have already seen, in fact, this morning. That's simply Mad-Event, the standard Mad-Event, also standalone. So standalone is, in fact, you simply take the square matrix element, you give a set of momentum, you wave back the square matrix element square. So you give a process, you give what is the momentum, you wave the square matrix element square. So that's quite often for testing purpose, but also to interface with external program. That's the new things that we discussed in the next slide. So C++ outputs, and then we use that for PKA, with written in C++. We have also standalone outputs. And the third language is Python, and that's simply for internal check that we'll probably use at the point. So inside matter 5, we are able to check automatically if the process is gauge invariant, if it's noise invariant, and it's LS coherent, I would say. So if we make the same process with different LS code, then you should have the same number. And that can check also automatically. And for that, we use, in fact, Python, which is much faster for this type of things. So let me discuss now what is the PTR-8 matrix element output. So that's simply a library of process, so with standard.h.cc, like for all C++ code. And that's what you give to, you can give that, in fact, to PTR-8, so that you can know. So before, in PTR, as Johan said, you need to write your process by hand. And in PTR can handle, in fact, 2 to 1, 2 to 2, and 2 to 3 process, in order to make the show one, in order to make the R-square matrix element. So that's, in some sense, what you need to give to PTR. And if you need to write that by hand, of course, that's a waste of time, I would say, because the program can do that by yourself. So this new output, in that sense, is very important. So that's just one example of the code, but that's not really important to me. And finally, the last part I would like to discuss is how to implement new physics model into MATLAB. So first, what is a model? So I put the answer back to that. So in Lagrangian, we have two parts. First, we have the field content, and we have the Lagrangians. So first, you need to know what is the particles and how they interact. But what's really interests us at the matrix element generation level, in fact, is the second level. It's more, for instance, basic. That means that we need to know simply what is the particles, what is the Feynman rules, which are a bit less basic than the Lagrangians, and what are the couplings definitions. So that's really what we want to aim, in fact, at the model level. Of course, we also need to know that the user will need to give what is the parameters, what is the masses, and what is the width. So, for example, from this point to this point, that will be the talk of Benjamin. Things tomorrow, Benjamin? Your talk?
I start tomorrow.
Yeah, you start tomorrow. That's Feynman rules. So that's a mathematical package which take exactly the field content of the Lagrangians and create, in fact, all the information that MATLAB needs, or MATLAB or any other matrix element generator, in that format so that you can simply plug and play into MATLAB and play with it. So there are in fact 3 different ways to implement a new model in MATLAB. So the first way is, of course, you take an existing model, and then you say, oh, I don't like that couplings for whatever reason. That's, I would like to remove that interactions. I would like to play with it. Then, of course, you can first take the model, open it, and change things by hand inside. That's an easy way to do. The second way is to simplify the model. What I call is that will be also described a bit more by Benjamin. That in fact you can say, in MATLAB 5, I will take this parent card, and I will like to optimize my model for this parent card. So that means that all the interactions with a 0 couplings, I will throw away of the model. And this will simplify the model quite a lot. Because, for example, if you take the standard model, and you say that the mass of the up is 0, and the UPR for the up is 0, that we are doing that all the time, that means that when you draw your diagrams, you compute those covered elements, you will not take all the diagrams with the x grouping to the up, which is, of course, totally irrelevant for physics. So that's one of the ways, in fact, to improve the efficiency and to gain speed and time at the end.
How about can we define the parity symmetry?
Parity symmetry I cannot implement in this sense here. Yeah. So the symmetry, or we can use the symmetry in MATLAB in some sense. So what we do in MATLAB, that's also a smart thing. I'm not sure that you answer the question, so if not, tell me after. For the symmetry, what we are doing, in fact, there are different quantum numbers associated with particles, and MATLAB looks if all the interactions make that those numbers are conserved by all the diagrams, by all the vertex. And if this is conserved, then when you generate a diagram, first looks if the global process agree with those conservation of charge or not. So that's how we treat quantum numbers, in fact, in MATLAB. Such that if you're making UU going in e to c minus, for example, will cross directly because the charge is a concept, for example. So that's the symmetry. But otherwise, for if you want to create a group of symmetry and see what's the spectrum, things like that, then you need, in fact, railroads. So then you need a Lagrangian with a given symmetry, and which then all the vertex will be associated to it and so on. And then that means that you need to be at this stage. So we cannot really deal with symmetry from scratch in some sense. We cannot say, I would like to conserve only particles with a given symmetry, which is that was the question, at least not in this stage. But in Payroll, there are also some other restrictions, and that really, but I'm not an expert on that part. We can also put a lot of restrictions, but we really say remove all interactions. Does anyone, is it possible that?
Remove everything?
No, to remove all interactions with subgroups given symmetry. Like A5, for example, in the restriction 5.
We need to define the quantum number
Sure,
at the level, and then it's possible.
Okay.
Not straightforward, but possible.
Right. That would be an famous level. So,
Can
yeah,
you
sure.
do the complex coupling? Complex coupling.
Compress, complete?
Complex.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's not all couplings are complex, in fact. That's not a problem. Other questions?
If the coupling is dependent on momentum, it is possible.
That's a good question, in fact, because this is in that, yes, there is Professor Kerwo, in fact. So, well, there is one case where it's possible, in fact, in some sense, alpha S. Because that's the one couplings. And that's a very specific case, in fact, for alpha S. So in that case, I like need to make the running of alpha S, and that might be 4x4 independent, things like that. Then we have a special treatment for this one. But it's very, in some sense, hard-coded for alpha S. So, as we discussed, in fact, that in plain rules, in fact, that alpha S should be written with a specific name so that MATLAB can know exactly how to deal that parameter, because it's a very specific one. And that means that in general, if you have couplings depending on the energy, that's not working. But now, if you
what you can always do, of course, is to use
put the pattern lines to do what that's right.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, in fact. So, of course, if it's on the momentum, I would say, then it's also maybe possible, in fact, to write it in the Lorentz path. So if the Lorentz path now is more complex, that's not a real problem. But the coupling itself should be better. So the last, and there was quite a few years ago, in fact, we used, oh yeah, so a question, please.
Is the coupling we defined running automatically, or just can you add RG running equation?
Sorry.
Can you add RG equation into the coupling?
For alphas, it's already implemented, or it's automatic.
Oh.
So this was the
Even if
question,
you put
this was the
the
question that Olivier just answered. So for alphas, it's already a strong coupling constant. It's implemented. For other couplings, you would need to implement. You would need to change the value of the coupling.
Or I can do it in So the final way, in fact, to create bar, I already discussed, in fact, on that one. So the final rules is simply taking the Lagrangians, and then you push on the button also, and then you create automatically a completely new model. So that's, of course, very, very powerful. But a lot of people, in fact, don't care about the Lagrangian that much. As experimentalists, if you speak about, oh, you want to add a new particle? Sure. Take frame rules and put the Lagrangian into frame rules, and then they will just look like that. No, you just want the new particles. No, that's exactly true, right? What they want, just take the model and add one particle to the given couplings, and well, the couplings can be quite complex, but some sense. Some of the people, for some good or bad reason, that's we can judge about that, they don't want to play with frame rules at least they don't want them. So we create, in fact, another way. But in fact, that's not really in that way. That way was much before frame rules. So that's also we need to see that as complementary way. So we create, in fact, that's Mon4 model. We create a framework where we can add new particles, then add new interactions with it, enter the expression for the couplings, then push the button and create the model. So I was thinking that I didn't have the time to do it, but clearly I have 10 minutes, so I will pass my conclusions and go into it. So let's take an example. Let's look at if you want to make this diagram with a T prime. So I would just like to have the T prime and particles, and what I need to do, so that's the coupling, the definition of the couplings from this paper. First, I will need to specify new particles and new interactions. So this is what we call the V-form model. So that's the user mode of the V-form model. At the point, we will make a user mode of the V5. So that's not exactly the model that you will see tomorrow with Benjamin, but that's the old model, but it's completely compatible with Mon4. So you need to, in fact, edit particles.dat and add the particles, which in this case is the T prime. So that's the name, the anti-name, the spin of the particles, that's the line type, that's how you draw it, so that's not that important. A name for the mass, a name for the width. Level, I'm not sure anymore. That's the tensor string. Yeah, that's the spin type. That's a name, and that's the PDG code. So simply gives the basic information about the particles. You need to give that information. Then in interactions of that, you simply say, okay, I want a coupling with T prime gluon. And with a coupling, which is GG, and is a type 2CP. So quite most basic information that you want to give something to the model. And of course, you can continue with other interactions. So now that we have the interactions, that you know how they interact, one important part in some sense is define those couplings. So, okay, I will speak that faster. that means that we need to modify couplings of F and simply define what are the couplings associated. So you can see that's the couplings that are here. And finally, you can also add new external parameters. So that's parameters that we define in your parent cards. So that's a parameter that the user in some sense should give. In some sense like the mass of the particles, the width of the particles, and things like that. So that's defined like in this variable name of that. And then in some sense you are ready to go. You are ready to start generating processes. So just push on the button, it creates a new model, then you can put the model in number 5. So just one point, this morning, we didn't do that yet. We will see in a couple of minutes how we generate a process from scratch, or we use another model, and that's in a couple of minutes maybe. So here it's not the standard UFO model, in fact, malware 5. This is the standard model of malware. So the command, in fact, to import the model is slightly different. So it's import model underscore vpro. It's quite important because otherwise it will not work. That's the name of the new model. Then you can generate, like usual, make the output, make the launch, and then here you are. So in some sense, when you create, or if you are quite fast in the tutorial at the end, you can play with this in fact. So making your own model, doing it. I think it will be probably too hard. We'll probably not take time for that. So that's the main idea. So clearly, I think new particles like that, it's very straightforward and quite easy to do. Probably not the most beautiful way, I would say, but okay. So first, thanks for listening. So in a couple of probably 30 minutes, in fact, it will be your turn to practice this. So we've seen a lot of things that Mon4 can do. So now, of course, what is even more important to me, in fact, that you take your computer and you start playing with it. And that's, of course, what we are going to do in 30 minutes. So that means generate process, generate events, making some first analysis, some games also. I forget one thing, but that's not that important. And so there's also game. Normally I should give you chocolates if you win the games, but I forget to buy the chocolates. So, so maybe 30 minutes are probably not at the time. So the people will win the game. I will give you the chocolate tomorrow in fact. So sorry about that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Olivier speaks very fast, so probably some of you couldn't hear hopefully the slides are very clear, so please go through slowly later. And also, during the tutorials, you do, and then you will really understand. So, any other questions? I had a question.
Sure.
So when you said V4 model,
Yeah.
it means that V4 stands for MGraph 4, right?
Yeah.
So do we still use MGraph 4 to make this model? And if we want to make a model by using this method of new particles interact, before simple things, that's easier, right?
Yeah.
It's faster than writing down the Lagrange.
Sure.
Especially for experimentals. And then we still use MGraph 4 to make this model file. And then we import this model to MGraph 5 by this method.
Yeah. But then, for example, you cannot create PK8 output because in that case, all the model is important, so you cannot translate it in C++. So if you're using V4 model, there is some limitations or what you can do, what you cannot do. But otherwise, that's the same.
We can still generate proton code.
Yeah. And then in that case, in fact, we also use, in fact, Elasticity. We not start by Aloha.
Oh, I see.
Because also in those models, you don't get the noise information. So in that case, that simply gets in some sense from the information on the vertex. So you don't take the joint information in those type of models. So of course you cannot ask Aloha to create the lasso key. So it simply takes the old symptoms LR package.
Actually, just remember, there was a small confusion between the Lagrangian and the final root or vertices among the questions. So please let me explain a little bit. Lagrangian is, well, when we call Lagrangian, actually it is Lagrangian density. It is a function of space-time. And local Lagrangian, quantum field theory deals with the local Lagrangian, well, local interactions, which is a function of one space-time point. Yeah. So Lagrangian, if we write Lagrangian, it is a function of x0, 1, 2, 3. And the action is the standard Lagrangian is just a triple integral of this Lagrangian density d3 to the x. So Lagrangian is a function of x, space-time point, and derivative. Okay. And each term operator is a function of only one x. That's called local Lagrangian. And when we evaluate the matrix element of this Lagrangian, we use for each field inside of the Lagrangian, we use this three-field expander. We solve the equations motion for when there is absolutely no interactions, and then we have the momentum eigenstates. So for a given momentum of the particle, we have the wave functions. Okay. So in order to evaluate the matrix elements for scattering, we use momentum eigenstate of the external particle. The free particles have definite momentum, and actually its location is not really determined because of the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. We just use how to call it, plane wave. Yeah, I wrote the exponential minus ik. Yeah? That's the wave function. So you cannot ask where it is. Its momentum is definite, but it's kind of expanded. Yeah? So when we calculate matrix elements, it is the momentum eigenstates coming up and momentum eigenstates going up. So the amplitude is a function of momentum. Okay. So when we translate the interactions, when the interactions in Lagrangian contains derivative, derivative applies to this wave function, and you see that inside of the wave function has this free field e to the minus ikx. And if you have a derivative applies to x, so you obtain k nu. Del nu gives k nu. Right? Sorry, maybe minus ik nu. But in any case, something like that appears. And it will become the vertex. Yeah? The interaction depends on p nu in that case. If the Lagrangian contains derivative, the interactions contains p nu in the momentum among the momentum items. So please distinguish this. Okay. So whenever we have derivative, we will have momentum among the vertex. And when Olivia talks about Lorentz structure of the interactions, it means that sometimes it is gamma nu for terminal, sometimes it is minus g mu for something like tensor, but sometimes it can be k nu, or it can be arbitrarily complicated. K nu times gamma nu times something like that. Those things are called Lorentz structure. Okay, in the language of vertices. Okay, hope you understood. But if you do not have a training on quantum field theory, what I said will be nothing but to just kind of put it somewhere. Yeah, that's what we work with quantum field. Okay, any other questions? So we want to start at 3, right? Tutorial.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the tutorial will be done in the 5th floor. Just we go up to the 5th floor, and there's a big room, and probably it is not prepared, right? Yeah, not at all. Okay,
After
so
it
beginning it can be just like.
So you can put this as they want. After this is 3 part movie, so.
It's probably good to live in the group right away, so
I
everybody.
hope I could think I can maybe.
But that we should, everybody should go there and do it once, right? Because otherwise, if you two of us do, it's a hard work. But if everybody does it, it's very easy. So, but probably we just after 3 o'clock, we can just use a few minutes to just one. Okay, so please, so there is a copy. Okay, that's very good. So this is a copy time, and after this, slightly before 3 p.m., you start going up. Okay.
매듭을 깔고 그림까지 이렇게 올라가면 내서 깔고 자, PT와 BGS 그건 안 된다.
지금 예전에 그 김도현한테 들었던 문제가 그대로 김도현한테 배운 대로 해도 잘 안 돼가지고
아니야.
더 돌리려면 슬래시 돌리면 있어야 이런 거만 계산하면
너무 쏟아지면 파도 내려주고
기생수 레벨 안 되죠. 파톤 레벨에 치티바가 가지고 적어도 얘를 차라리까지 해야 돼.
그 파도 레벨을 사주는 거 다잖아.
아니 그 피치 저거 제스피티가 받은 거는 저기서 피치를 했어요.
제스피티는 해야 돼. 아니 제스도 있잖아. 기타한테 있잖아.
제스피가 있어요.
파도 잡으면
그것까지 지금 레벨을
그러니까 파도 레벨 사주는 거는 레벨을 할 거야.
피치하는
아니면 모태카로 이렇게 해주는
이거 계속 켜져 있는 건가?
디텍트 시뮬레이션까지 할 거 아니면
내가 생각할 때는
무슨 소리 말하는 거야? 욕하면 안 돼.
아니, 네가 원하는 예를 들어 그런 뭐에다 이베를
Z 파이널 스테이트
그러면 올라와봐. 제일 알고 있는 거야.
I have only electronic.
Okay. That's why you can.
Yes.
Yeah. That's the only one.
Yes.
Yeah.